Good evening from New York. I'm Dan Rather with news, analysis, and commentary. When big tobacco began to lose ground in the U.S., they fought hard to survive by carving out new territory everywhere else. With fewer regulations to fight, big tobacco created new markets and new smokers in the third world, developed nations, and places in between. Now it's American gun makers' turn. As big tobacco was, some of the biggest gun makers in the country now are under siege. Remington, which made the rifle used in the Sandy Hook school shooting, filed for bankruptcy back in March. Stock prices for other gun companies have been down since Donald Trump took office, as anti-government fear is no longer driving gun sales. Ruger made the rifle used in last year's Texas church shooting, and they're holding their shareholder meeting next month. Ruger's shareholders include the private equity firm BlackRock and Amalgamated Bank. Both of those institutions are calling for Ruger to change how it does business, to back measures to minimize gun violence. Amalgamated says it will not vote for Ruger chairwoman Sandra Froman, who also sits on the board of the National Rifle Association, the NRA. America's gun makers are losing at the cash register, losing investor support, and losing the public relations battle, so they could use the lifeline, which is where the Trump administration comes in. For years, gun makers like Smith & Wesson and Ruger have had to go through rigorous regulations, courtesy of the U.S. State Department. But that's about to change. In an exclusive story today by the Young Turks, a lawyer working for the National Shooting Sports Foundation says he expects that in the next month or so, jurisdiction over firearm exports will be moved away from the State Department. Instead, gun sales overseas will go through the Commerce Department. And as the name implies, the priority there is commerce. The export rules at Commerce are looser than those at State, which means the Trump Commerce Department will be free to open the floodgates for exporting guns. That means far easier exports to the European Union, Australia, Argentina, Japan, and South Korea. The new rules could mean sales to individual civilians, but also to some police forces for entire countries. One economist estimated that the change could increase sales by at least 1%, which may sound small, but amounts to more than $10 million for Ruger alone. Defenders of this move say this will help small gun companies compete by accessing overseas markets. Analysts who cover the gun industry, however, say the big gun makers have the resources to profit most from it, and the brand names that buyers around the world know from movies and the kind of belligerent, militaristic advertising that has made guns popular not just among hunters and outdoorsmen, but among the political paranoid, enemies of the government, and white supremacists. We should add, by the way, that the lawyer working for the gun industry actually wrote the legal language that would move gun exports from state to commerce. And he wrote it while he was in the Obama administration, where the switch originated. He says the move had nothing to do with politics. It was, he says, just for bureaucratic efficiency. He also says that he was going to sign off on the change all the way back in December of 2012. Then the Sandy Hook school shooting took place. Since that time, of course, the number of children dead from gunfire has increased. The timing for exporting America's firearms and American gun culture to the rest of the world is never. I've said it before and now say it again. The top three priorities for our country today should be, number one, education. Number two, education. And number three, education. And public schools are the backbone of our hopes. Unfortunately and dangerously so, public schools are under attack from various powerful forces, including the present administration in Washington and in state houses around the country. Exhibit A is President Trump's Secretary of Education, Betty DeVos. Now, with that as a preface, note what's happening in Arizona. Schools all across the state were closed again today as thousands of teachers continued protests for higher pay and more funding for their students. What began in West Virginia, spread to Kentucky and Oklahoma, is now red hot in Arizona and Colorado. So what's really going on here? How did it come to this? Well, let's back up and take a wide shot. It's being called the decade of neglect. Republican-dominated state legislatures have slashed school budgets for years. Local governments, including school boards, which make up the balance of funding, often with property taxes, were hammered during the recession that began a decade ago. And what's happened since? The economy has recovered. Funding for schools has not. Overall, money for public education has declined dramatically over the last decade. 29 states provided less overall student funding in 2015 than in 2008. Here's something else. Since the recession, more than 130,000 education jobs have been eliminated, while at the same time, school enrollment has increased by about 1.5 million students. It is the most surprising story of 2018 so far. Teachers who say they won't take it anymore. And Republican orthodoxy has been turned on its head. In tax-cut-crazy Oklahoma, the GOP-dominated state legislature just voted for a tax increase on the long, sacred, and protected oil industry. American teachers are having their moment. For how long it will last and to what lasting effect is uncertain. What is certain is that the future of our nation depends on quality public education. Teachers working 3 jobs to make ends meet can't be expected to be at their best in front of a classroom full of your children. Nor should they be expected to buy school supplies out of their own pockets, as many of them do. And by the way, when we look for the state that had the largest percentage change in spending per student, it's Arizona, where it was down 36%. As for teacher pay, the average Arizona teacher makes about $45,000 a year. That ranks 49th nationally, 49th. No wonder those teachers are marching. Today, the reality of the stakes of journalism, which are too often forgotten, were made painfully clear in Afghanistan. I'll have more about that next. I see what we all see. The deep divisions, the endemic injustices, the uncertainty about our future. We have sometimes stumbled. We have sometimes fallen short. But we can renew our national purpose if we recognize that what unites us is far greater and stronger than all that divides us.
Look, we're doing interviews over there at youtube.com/TYT interviews, and we've done some amazing ones recently.
So now, of course, you know the person most widely considered to be the most progressive senator is Bernie Sanders. Yeah. Why not back him during the 2016 primaries? Why be a Democrat at all?
And we're in a time where you cannot, in good conscience, sit on the sidelines of history.
My heart is heavy today with news of more terrorist bombings in Kabul. One of those bombings targeting journalists. At last count, 10 journalists were dead. Many were people who have dedicated years to covering this important and vastly underreported story. And this is a reminder of the dangers of the profession, especially in places where violence is used to keep the truth hidden. Every reporter covering a dateline like Afghanistan knows that a peaceful morning can suddenly turn into a bloody hell. But the calling to bear witness to the tides of history is too great for members of this dedicated group to give up the responsibility. Afghanistan doesn't get much coverage in today's America, never mind that our service members continue to be deployed there in harm's way. And we as a country bear responsibility for a nation in which we've been engaged in multiple forums for over 16 years. I've been to Afghanistan many times, and I have a special affinity for the land and its people. I'm grateful as a journalist and as a citizen to those who continue to report this story. Whenever I come across an article or TV news report on Afghanistan, I try to make sure to give it the attention it deserves. The press as an institution is not perfect. Those of us who work in journalism are far from perfect. But it is a vital source for information and a reckoning on the powerful. Please take a moment to think of the people who died today, their families and their colleagues. Think of the countless more who continue to die in Afghanistan, especially the locals, the Afghans, who have nowhere else to go. Try to make sure that this important story remains in our national consciousness, and support the journalistic outlets that remember that there is more to the news than the vulgarities of the American political scene, no matter how important that story is. Now, I mean this as no self-serving statement, but I'm one of not very many American journalists who have been to North Korea. To my Western eyes and mind, it's one of the strangest, oddest places on earth, with almost incomprehensible mind and thought control by the dictatorial government. The longer one is in North Korea, the more one knows how much one doesn't know. It is in that spirit that I submit the following. Few geopolitical crises have simmered with more combustible energy longer than the instability on the Korean Peninsula. It was the fierce and bloody Korean War of the 1950s that was the backdrop of my college years. And throughout my decades as a reporter, that unfinished conflict has never been far from the headlines. In the past, there have been some moments of optimism for, if not a peace, then at least a thawing of hostility. But those moments have been the exception. Most of the trend lines have been toward greater danger, a reality that has sprung into ever more urgent reality with the reclusive and repressive regime of North Korea becoming a nuclear power, and one armed with an increasingly sophisticated arsenal of short, medium, and long-range missiles. The Korean stalemate has dominated American concerns in East Asia and bedeviled every president who has had to confront it, regardless of their ideology or party affiliation. It is against this backdrop that what can only be described as an historic meeting took place this past week between the leaders of North and South Korea. This was the fruition of a strategy pursued by President Moon of South Korea, who has called for greater engagement and reconciliation with his neighbor to the north. We are now in the third generation of the Kim dynasty in North Korea, and the relatively new and still quite young leader, Kim Jong-un, remains a mystery wrapped in an enigma. His consolidation of power has been, by all accounts, swift, brutal, and remorseless. Up until now, his attitude towards the outside world was bellicose, mixed with a determination to grow his nuclear might as the ultimate checkmate to those who would seek to overthrow him by force. But that Kim seemed far removed from the one who met his South Korean counterpart this week, promising to shutter his nuclear testing sites, open them up to foreign inspection, and negotiate a nuclear-free Korean peninsula in the future. So now the stage is set for a summit with President Trump. Is this a trap set by North Korea to buy more time and gain global legitimacy for its regime? Is there really a path to peace? Is President Trump prepared for these delicate negotiations? Was this brought about because of the president's tough talk and earlier threats to North Korea, or to spite them? What role will China play, and our Japanese allies who remain very nervous? Never mind the South Koreans. Many longtime Korean watchers feel the chances of failure and disappointment, even maybe escalation, are high. But there's also a sense that this may be different. No matter what anyone may think of President Trump, we all must hope that we can begin a path toward a lessening of tension, if not outright peace. Millions of lives hang in the balance. After a short break, grim revelations about Sean Hannity's new uncovered real estate empire. So stay here with us.
All right, well, the Young Turks special election day coverage dropping.
An amazing power panel.
Look at this panel. You want to talk about power?
Like a smart Destiny's Child.
We're all too strong.
We start a revolution. Yes, another one. Aren't you excited?
Wow. Some of the best writers in the country are right here on this panel, with the obvious exception of John Irola.
Let's not so quickly discount Harry Potter fan fiction.
We have elected the top Twitter troll in the country.
What ran me away from Christianity was judgment and condemnation.
Assaulting peaceful protesters in North Dakota, crazier than bombing Yemen, crazier than bombing Syria so much they ran out of bombs.
Reductive interpretation of what their motives are, what Putin's are, by these amateur experts is just beyond.
We don't kill our journalists, and they do.
After it was revealed that Sean Hannity used government assistance to buy some of the 870 homes he owns through 20 shell companies, the Fox News host explained that his real estate investments are actually something akin to charity work. It is ironic, he said, that I am being attacked for investing my personal money in communities that badly need such investment. And he added, again I quote, "These are investments I do not individually select, control, or know the details about, except that obviously I believe in putting my money to work in communities that otherwise struggle to receive such support," unquote. But now we've learned that some of those communities are struggling precisely because Mr. Hannity put his money to work there. The Guardian newspaper, who first broke this story, took a look at eviction records at one Georgia apartment complex owned by Mr. Hannity. After he put his money to work in that community, eviction orders increased by 400%. Not all those residents actually got evicted. Some just had to pay late fees that could amount to almost half their monthly rent. This, by the way, in a town where the average annual income is just over $20,000. Then there's the Meadows, a Georgia subdivision Hannity owns with more than 100 homes. The Los Angeles Times found increases there too, but not in eviction rates. The previous owner of the blue-collar African-American neighborhood kept the rents low, telling the Times that a lot of the renters were longtime residents or elderly people. Then Sean Hannity put his money to work in the community. In the 5 years since, rents have gone up 50%. Hannity scooped up these and many other properties for rock-bottom prices after the mortgage crisis. At the time, Hannity blamed poor home buyers for the crisis. In a videotape we unearthed last week, he said the problem was Americans who thought they had a right to own their own home.
You're wrong in stating where the problem came from. The problem came from this notion that everybody in America had a right to a house, whether they could ever afford to pay their loan back. That's what the Community Reinvestment Act was all about.
We should mention that the Times discovered many of the renters there were unaware Sean Hannity was their landlord. And at least one said he didn't even know who Hannity is. Just ahead, a most shameful part of America's history is now memorialized in Alabama.
Do you trust the establishment media?
The United States economy has never been better. Monetary policy is spectacular.
Everybody thought Jamie Dimon was the king of Wall Street last week. Well, it might be Ken Lewis now. He takes the crown. The best sales force out there is Merrill Lynch, and now it goes to BofA. It's pretty amazing.
Pretty amazing. Lewis now. Buying opportunity.
I do think this is a buying opportunity. We're going to see a stabilization and just a tremendous snapback.
The rally will be jaw-dropping.
The Occupy Wall Street movement is not a spontaneous protest against economic inequality.
This is what we mean by the establishment press.
It is a well-thought-out campaign.
To bring down the infrastructure of this country.
The embarrassment is that I'm given credibility in this world because of the disappointment that the public has in what the news media does.
I'm the former chairman of the Veterans Committee, and I learned a little bit about the cost of war. What the president is trying to do, and I agree with him, is to do everything that we can without going to war.
So what do you say to your critics? I'm talking about Democratic critics who say, you know what, he's really just a socialist pacifist.
I very rarely read in any coverage of Bernie that he's a socialist.
Bernie Sanders is a socialist, for God's sake.
Most analysts are saying that Hillary Clinton's going to win in a landslide.
I continue to believe Mr. Trump will not be president.
I've got Trump at 279, 259.
Wait a minute. I'm winning the presidency. I know you don't believe that. Sorry, we're not going to be polite anymore. You know what we're going to do? We're going to fight back.
Fight for a free and independent media. We're done with politeness. We fight back.
That's 300 million. That's a pretty good number. We were doing a press release on it, and I got all worked up. And I said, okay, well, that's the size of the U.S. population. You know what our next target is? The size of the entire world on the road to 6 billion. Although by the time we hit it, it'll probably be 7, maybe 8 billion.
Not a big deal. A couple of days ago on the TYT network, we passed 1 billion views.
What the hell?
What the hell?
No, that's a big freaking deal.
2 billion views.
What now?
Sorry.
What did we do? 2 billion?
2 billion.
They said it couldn't be done, but it was done.
We just crossed 5 billion views on YouTube.
I mean, imagine 10 years ago thinking, one day.
People looked at you like, are you nuts? Young Turks crosses 6 billion views. They said you couldn't do it. You can't change the media. Don't try. Well, here we are. We're changing the media. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
It seems especially fitting in our charged political times when our racial divisions are being stirred for cynical political benefit that one of the most brutal and forgotten chapters of our nation's history should be brought out into the public's consciousness. The opening of the new National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama, made news across the country in newspapers, on TV and radio, and in online reporting. By all accounts, this new museum is a chillingly effective monument to those who suffered under white supremacy, especially the thousands of lynching victims. I was born into an America that still had numerous lynchings every year. This is not ancient history, and the echoes of it are very much evident in today's society. We cannot glorify our nation's history at the expense of this bloody and shameful truth. When I hear many of our current political leaders downplay the plight of racial minorities and paint white America as victims, I'm filled with anger and sadness. We need to etch the history of white supremacy in our collective consciousness so that we can approach the present and the future with more humility and empathy. There are some memories that will forever haunt me, that still cause a physical reaction, a shortness of breath, a shiver of recognition and recollection. And few stories shaped me more than the ones I covered during the Civil Rights Movement. From voting rights protests to sit-ins to witnessing Klan rallies, I could feel the hatred and intimidation course through the cities, towns, and farmland of the American South. I knew, as a journalist working at CBS News, dubbed the Colored Broadcasting Network by many of the local power brokers in the South at that time, I knew that I was an outsider and a potential target. But I also knew that whatever fear I felt could never approach the sheer terror directed at African Americans. The South then, and even fairly large pockets of the North, was in essence run with a strong current of racial terror, where subjugation was achieved through the constant threat of violence and often violence itself. This was epitomized by lynchings. Many heroes fought at the time to bring an end to this murderous tactic of racial subjugation: lawyers, journalists, politicians, clergy, and even artists. I'd like to leave you this evening with one of the most powerful songs ever written about the American experience. It's about lynchings and was famously performed by Billie Holiday and entitled "Strange Fruit." Its lyrics will likely haunt you and deserve to do so. And I'm glad that there's now a museum to bring this vital lesson to people for generations to come, lest we forget.
Southern trees bear strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood at the root, black bodies swinging in the southern breeze, strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees. Pastoral scene of the gallant South, the bulging eyes and the twisted mouth, scent of magnolia, sweet and fresh. Then the sudden smell of burning flesh. Here is a fruit for the crows to pluck, for the rain to gather, for the wind to suck, for the sun to rock, for the tree to drop. Here is a strange and bitter cry.
With the haunting voice and words of Billie Holiday, I leave you for this news cycle. The Young Turks is next, and we'll be back with the news at the same place and time, 5:30 Eastern, every Monday. Until then, Dan Rather reporting. Stay steady.